Yeah, I don't think it's totally fair to put all of this on Gary Gensler. Now, I think that there's obviously been actions by the SEC which haven't helped the public perception and helped the case. And there are times where you wonder, like, why won't they just give some answer or some clarity? But I don't think it's fair to say it's all them. I think that it is all the players in this all the stakeholders. But ultimately, the first people that need to act is Congress.
Don't worry, we are friends.
And welcome back to the Friends Validator YouTube channel. This is a YouTube channel you should subscribe to if you want to stay on top of everything that is happening in the proof of stake and staking sector. And today I have the pleasure to welcome Andrew Hemmingway from Ava Labs to the show. And we have a super important topic to discuss today. It's about what the hell is going on in the US with the SEC, with securities, with regulation, and all of these things, what it means for the industry, what it means for you personally as well. So let us not hesitate anymore and let's dive straight into it. Andrew, thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yuri, for having me on. We were great to connect with you in Barcelona, and great to be able to be on the show with you now.
Yeah, 100%. The pleasure is totally mine. And just for like kind of a context for people. So you're doing all of the legal and regulatory communication at Ava Labs. So I think this is like very important to clarify this so that people like know what you do at the side of Avalanche. But yeah, I mean, the shock was pretty big. All of a sudden, the SEC declared a basket of assets as a security. To get people on the same page, first of all, what is a security? And what were your initial thoughts when you read the news?
Yeah, so let me just kind of add a little context. I think would be helpful. I help with policy communications, and I most importantly help on a policy project with Ava Labs called Owl Explains. And you can find us on all the major social media channels, podcasts, all that sort of stuff. But Owl Explains is an initiative of Ava Labs to educate and inform the stakeholders and users of blockchain and crypto around not only just the fundamentals of what blockchain is and the promise and hope that it represents to humanity, but also talking about the regulatory environments across the globe. So we don't just talk about the US. We are talking about what's happening in the EU and Asia, of course, and other jurisdictions. So that's sort of my background and the scope of the work that I'm actively involved in day to day. To your question about what is a security, I think, man, this is the $1 million question. This is the point where there's a lot of really smart people who are defining what a security is today in very different ways. Here's what I think is at the core of it. The SEC today, under the guidance of Chair Gensler, is defining a security by the contract that guides it. And so he looks at the smart contract, regardless of what the asset is underneath it, and says if you're buying for investment purposes, for the purpose of increasing in value without active participation in the outcome, that qualifies under the Howey test as a security. And Chair Gensler, while a little confusing on figuring out what exactly that means for the market and how that plays out, has said multiple times that he believes that means all crypto, basically outside of Bitcoin, are securities. Now, at the same time, the other regulatory body in the United States, and there are a few, but the other major one in this discussion is the CFTC. The CFTC regulates the commodities markets, spot markets, and has great jurisdiction in regular traditional financial markets in protecting investors. And so there's another agency that's involved here. While the SEC has been certainly taking the headlines They are not the only agency. The head of that agency has declared that all crypto are commodities. And so while one agency says, look, this is perfectly clear, you just need to come to the SEC and register with us, another agency says, oh, it's very clear, you should just come and register with us. And what the industry is saying is like, just somebody tell us which direction we're supposed to go in. What is a security? When we're talking about crypto, I think the nature of the asset matters. And on the Owl Explains website, we go into great detail and we outline what is the proper, sensible way to classify tokens. Not all tokens are the same. Not all tokens are created in the same way. And while they are inherently software or inherently code, they operate, function, are used, intended to be used in various ways, and therefore should not all be classified under a one-size-fits-all type of a mode. And we're trying to push back against that. The last thing I would say on this question is, every major developing country or region in the world today is working on a framework for digital assets. And whether that's crypto or blockchain or, let's just call it digital assets. And what's kind of odd to me is that there's some in the United States who are saying, well, our current laws are adequate. So basically every other country in the world didn't have adequate laws. I mean, it's like saying like the EU didn't have adequate security laws. Well, no, of course they did, right? I mean, they've had security laws for as long as the US has. They've been functioning in a fantastic way, just like the US has. Everybody has their problems and that's the way it's supposed to be. But like, it's really weird to me to say, while every other country is doing something, the US doesn't need to do it. We should just do what we've been doing. And I think what that is more of, there's other layers of that discussion that are going on there. And really at the core of it, it's politics. It's just like, we're stuck in this political battle. And unfortunately, it means the livelihoods, the investments, today, those engaged in the crypto market are at risk of another enforcement action that could come at any time for any reason. And there's no real security in the space. So that's a long-winded intro and answer to your initial question, but hopefully we covered some of the bases there.
Yes, 100%. I think this was also very important here to go into this very basic question, what is the security, so deeply. So my big takeaway here as well was that there is not one entity that defines that, but there's also the CFTC in the US. So also enterprises like, for example, Coinbase, they need to ask themselves, okay, who are we like talking to now? So where there are also like communication gaps, i.e. the CFTC was saying this and the SEC was saying something completely else, and then Coinbase was more or less lost. Was this also the case?
Right. And I mean, Coinbase specifically, they last year filed a memo to the SEC saying, please give us some clarity. And the SEC has refused to do that. Coinbase then, within last month, sued the SEC saying, you have to respond to our request, right? Because it's like, we're asking you, what is it that we're supposed to be doing or not doing? The SEC won't reply. And just yesterday, actually, the SEC replied and said, we need another 120 days to determine, just to respond to you. And so, this type of behavior doesn't fit with the narrative, oh, everything's perfectly clear, just come in and you just register and everything will be fine. At the same time, when somebody asks a question, they can't answer the question. So I mean, this is what is creating sort of the troubling environment in the economy today, or in the space today, and why the US, I think, is kind of like frozen right now in place. I mean, there isn't really a lot of forward movement. Well, there's probably not much of any until this becomes clear.
I think this was actually also my next question here. So the Coinbase and a lot of enterprises were asking, they were basically begging the SEC for regulation. They were begging, hey, please come and regulate us, right? They wanted clarity. This was like one of the biggest goals that all of these enterprises had.
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't really seem like it that there's a regulatory clarity right now, no? So like even after now suing Coinbase, Binance, and so on and so forth, after all of this drama now and the declaration of several assets as a security, would you say that there's kind of clarity now or something to work with?
No,
Not at all.
there's not. I mean, even in the congressional hearing yesterday, there were congressmen saying, why if everything's a security, if that's sort of the statement, right? If everything's security, then why in this most recent lawsuit are only 13 coins or only 13 tokens mentioned? Why weren't all of them mentioned? Coinbase has over 200 coins listed on their exchange, and so I think that there was questions about that, understanding that there's no real guidance given on why those tokens were called out and others weren't, right? And while nobody wants to get called out and nobody wants to be highlighted in that way, it is what proves that we don't really have clarity. This should be something that should be a bright line, right? Like we should know clearly this is a stock, this is a mutual fund, this is options, this is a commodity. Those things are clear in the market. No one is running around going, hey, is this a stock or not, right? Like what a stock is, what a mutual fund is, what options are. What's a digital asset today? Like nobody knows. Now this problem exists because Congress hasn't done it. So in the US, Congress makes the laws. The regulatory agencies interpret and enforce the laws. So the reason why, and I understand, I think some of the confusion, it's not necessarily the SEC or the CFTC's fault. It's really that because Congress hasn't given clear definitions. Congress is the one who needs to say, this is what a digital asset is. This is where they fall. If they're doing these things, they're a security. If they're doing these things, they're a commodity. If they're doing these things, they're banking, and make that allocation. That's what Congress needs to do. Congress hasn't done that. And so therefore you have regulatory agencies who truthfully are trying to do their job and are trying to say, look, we see these as securities. And if we see them as securities, we need to act as if they are securities. And the CFTC saying we see them as commodities. So if we see them as commodities, we need to act as that way. The confusion ultimately exists because Congress hasn't done their job. And that really is where this conversation needs to come back to. And there is a bill right now coming through Congress. Hopefully they can reach some sort of a bipartisan consensus around it, and move this whole conversation forward.
So essentially the problem is much, much deeper, because if you're on Twitter nowadays, it's basically Gary Gensler being portrayed as Mr. Burns and his fault, and he just woke up in the morning and said, today we will declare asset 1, 2, 3, and 4 as a security, and we will sue Coinbase. But apparently the problem is much deeper. Say that the Congress did not come up with a very, very good definition of what a security is. And Gary Gensler and the SEC and also the CFTC, they just have an interpretation of what the Congress might say or think, or how they vaguely declared what digital assets are from a regulatory perspective.
That's right. Yeah, I don't think it's totally fair to put all of this on Gary Gensler. Now, I think that there's obviously been actions by the SEC which haven't helped the public perception and helped the case. And there are times where you wonder, like, why won't they just give some answer or some clarity? But I don't think it's fair to say it's all them. I think that it is all the players in this, all the stakeholders. But ultimately, the first people that need to act is Congress. So hopefully, we see that soon.
So this was also one of my questions I've noted before the interview was, is there a way back? And the way back is not that necessarily Gary Gensler gets fired or whatever we see on Twitter. The most important thing here is that the Congress comes up with a good definition. And from there, it would be actually pretty easy for the SEC to act accordingly, no?
Correct. Right. So right now, there is a few bills, but there's one sort of larger bill. I would call it kind of like MICA, but a little bit lighter than that. But it is a framework bill which would give clear definitions, would assign regulatory agencies into their jurisdictions, and would give the businesses who are operating today what they call a safe harbor, an opportunity or a path to becoming legal, or a path to complying to the new law. And so that's necessary, just because you can't just have a business today and do something different tomorrow, right? Like every business isn't going to just comply on the next day. It's just not possible. So you've got to give some time in order for that to happen, and that's just the safe harbor idea. So I think it's there. I think the United States feels the pressure, especially with the EU and the UK, coming up with framework bills. Singapore, Japan, other jurisdictions really coming into play, Hong Kong now. So I think that there's a lot of pressure for them to act, and there's bipartisan support, not overwhelming, but there's bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate to see something like this come forward. The question is, where does the administration sit? Does President Biden sign something like this? We really don't know. I think that's the honest answer. It's just like we don't know if it can get through the House and Senate. You would imagine that he would sign it, but we're going to have to wait and see.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting discussion right here. And I also wanted to talk about this point. See, like in 2021, when China banned Bitcoin effectively and Bitcoin mining, a new crypto hub was popping up in Texas, in Austin, for example. And the crypto industry was celebrating the US as the country of the free, as a new hub of innovation. And back then, it also felt like that the SEC is a little bit more open towards crypto, because hooray, the party was going on, crypto was innovation, the mood was good, so to speak. And now all of a sudden it doesn't feel like it anymore. It feels more that the US is not welcoming innovation, but sets an environment of confusion, where people or enterprises are sometimes even forced to leave the US. I think Coinbase is also considering that. So my question here is very obvious. What does all of this mean for the US now? Is the US still an ideal place for innovating with cryptocurrency, or do founders look for options now, for other options in other jurisdictions?
I think it depends on the nature of the business that you're operating in. This is a different answer for different businesses. The reason why is because the U.S. is obviously still the largest, most liquid, most valuable market in the world. So this is still where 20 of the top 25 venture capitalists are based out of. This is still where majority of investors are. When you think about retail investors, majority of those retail investors globally exist in the United States. So the market is just too big for people to say, we're going to just walk away from this totally. Instead, what they're trying to do is perhaps base their company outside of the US without losing access to the US market. And I think that is what they're trying to figure out. How can they transact and do business in the US without losing the US market, but also at the same time not fall under the stringent purview of the SEC as it stands today. And so, these are things that are just going to have to be worked out over time. I mean, it's a bigger deal because it is dealing with currency. It's dealing with capital markets. In the early 2000s, you had the internet boom, but like in the internet boom, we had e-commerce stores selling dog food, Yahoo starting a search engine, right? Like we weren't dealing with capital markets. This was the boom of the internet was obviously transformational from a consumer connectivity and a consumer interaction and shopping perhaps revolution, but it wasn't upsetting capital markets, and we weren't rewriting the stock market, and we weren't coming up with new currencies like that. That's not what happened. This this revolution is. And those two revolutions are tied together, right? Like one had to come before the other. But we're at a point in time where this is really disruptive to a lot of foundational pieces of existing markets, existing countries, power structures, right? Like all of these things are come into play now. And so I think that what you're seeing is careful approaches, thoughtful approaches, really knowing that we aren't just talking about selling dog food. We're really talking about, entire capital markets, which is a very different discussion.
Yeah, totally agree. I think the Web3 revolution is, from that perspective, way more complex compared to the discussions that we had like 20 years ago or so. But you mentioned a couple of things that were, in my view, very interesting, and I really want to dive deeper here because you mentioned the Web2 revolution, and that there was also a lot of unclarity in the very, very beginning, and that also the US is feeling the pressure from the EU and other jurisdictions. So my question now is there like a huge lobby that is basically fighting for Web3 right now that puts more pressure on it, so that everything is being made sure that we have like a good regulatory framework in the US as soon as possible, so that there is regulatory clarity?
There is growing support from that. So there are a number of trade associations now that have formed. There's a good base that is coming into fruition. And what's interesting is a lot of these folks that are forming these groups are coming out of government. They're coming out of the Fed, coming out of the SEC, and so you're seeing now the crypto industry maturing in a way where they are building practices and they're building teams of experienced professionals, from these markets. And there is, I'm not sure, I know the spending on lobbying, and I know that has increased for sure. But really more than that and more effective than that, I think, is this base of education and information and activity around crypto has really increased. I mean, this is a dramatic increase, even year over year right now. And so, yeah, there's a lot more happening in Washington. There's a lot more discussions about it. And I really believe that momentum pushes these bills forward. And I think we'll see votes on a real bill, perhaps even this summer in the House, and hopefully, before the new year, this is a bill that gets to the president's desk.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting take here, and also like an obvious one, because crypto is not a lobby or like a niche anymore. It's like much larger, and I think 2022 has shown very dramatically what happens if you basically step back and leave the industry as it is. A lot of people can also suffer in crypto if there are not enough eyeballs watching. And I think you're totally right. There are other people now fighting for the industry compared to a couple of years ago. I think one of the most prominent names is Hester Peirce. So there are a lot of important people, fighting for the industry here. But once again, I want to zoom out and go back to the SEC and ask a question that I think a lot of people within the crypto industry or on crypto Twitter are not asking, whether there is a case for the SEC to be right that this basket of securities, let it say ADA, Atom, and all of the other assets that were listed there, is there actually eventually a case that would justify the decision for the SEC to clarify these assets as a security?
Yeah, there's and look, I think the overwhelming majority of companies in the space today would say, if the SEC and the courts agree and Congress agrees that this basket of coins, tokens, are going to be regulated as securities, those companies, and here's the path for how to reach compliance. those companies would do it in a second. Most of these companies are already, they're trying to register with states. They're trying to, they're proactively trying to do that. Like, the people driving this conversation for regulatory clarity is the industry, right? This isn't the industry who is just running around trying to evade Washington or trying to evade any rules or laws at all. No, like, they're actually in Washington trying to work with lawmakers to say, let's reach some sort of a consensus. So if it was determined that the SEC is right, then no, I honestly don't think that there would be a lot of pushback. It would just be like, okay, then what is the path for us to get there? Right now, the problem is saying this is a security, but there's really no path to get there. Or this is a security, and then someone else saying this is a commodity, and someone else saying, no, this is banking, and trying to say, well, do I register with everybody? Right? Because obviously we can't do that. So how do we navigate this? And instead we don't, instead of getting help, we get lawsuits, right? So like that I think is sort of the attitude or the tenor of the industry today. Just trying to figure out what is it that we're doing, and how do we move forward, and how do we operate a legal business, because that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, totally agree on this. And what I hear there is, like, also in combination of what you mentioned in the beginning, that there are enterprises that want to have access to the US market, because that's also like kind of this kind of populism that you see on Twitter right now. The US is not an innovating country anymore. Everyone is leaving the US. There's no interest in doing that, essentially because the US is still the largest liquid market. But still everything feels a little bit messy. So if the SEC would have gone ahead and have said, for example, all proof of stake coins, or every coin that lies on a proof of stake infrastructure, is a security, and here is a 2-page long explanation of how to become compliant in order to offer trading with this, the Coinbase and Binance would have been super happy with that.
Correct. They would have done it.
Yeah, okay, that's pretty interesting, because now I think everything seems a little bit messy, because when I like saw this basket of assets, there were assets like Atom, ADA, and so on into it, but there wasn't, for example, Sol or also AVAX was not in this basket. So for me, it really didn't get that clear. Okay, what is the security now and what not? Because from a technical perspective, a lot of these coins working very, very similar. So where are like the differences between the assets that got declared as a security and assets that were not mentioned in it?
Yeah, and I mean we can't and I don't want to guess for the SEC, right? I don't want to get in a place where I'm trying to guess what they were thinking, but I think there is some comment to be made around what we would call the nature of the asset. So that there is, and it should be taken into consideration, where the technology that is driving the asset and what is the purpose of the asset. There are clearly some tokens that are being created simply for the purpose of increasing in value and driving some growth in token price, and the collective is benefiting from that, right? Like, that seems to me like a really clear security. I mean, that is what it is. But there are also tokens that are being made that are necessary to the functioning of the network, right? Like tokens and coins are part of the conversation because they're a function of the technology. They're not stocks, right? It's how blockchains communicate with each other. And honestly, it's how AI communicates and how AI functions, which is why there's this natural organic overlap between blockchain and AI today, which adds a whole nother layer of difficulty on top of all of this conversation. But just the fundamental understanding that blockchains communicate through the transferring of these tokens. So it's really important that the nature of the asset is understood, and how it's being used, how it's being and how it's functioning, and not just that there's the presence of a smart contract makes it a security. No, that's instead the smart contract should clarify whether it is a security, a commodity, right? Whether it is some other sort of asset class, and I think that is what is missing in the conversation to date. That is where there's some very significant, a difference of opinions.
Yeah, I think this is very important to have like also this neutral view here. And yeah, I totally agree on everything what you just mentioned. But yeah, all in all, I think we are getting back to the point where everything seems a little bit confusing for a lot of people, or for people who are not too familiar with law, or just new in the crypto industry.
Yes.
But yeah, I would have another question before creating like an overview of everything what we just have discussed.
Sure.
I mean, do also people like try to avoid these new definitions of what security is or not by, for example, DeFi? Because I mean, there's one part of the story where you say, okay, this and this and this and this is a security, and Coinbase is being forced to act accordingly. But there's also a world, i.e., Uniswap, where you can trade everything what's out there with no one asking what is a security, what is this, what is that, where you basically have the Wild West where you can do everything. So
Right.
I would like to also ask the question of the efficiency of this paper that was being published, and if most people are just using DeFi solutions for the necessity to trade whatever they can without asking what a security is.
Yeah. So this is where, the conversation at its first level is, what's a security, what's a commodity, right? DeFi represents something that takes that conversation to another level. um, and the technology continues to expand even around DeFi. I mean, we're still trying to figure out from Congress some clarity around just the very beginning of like proof of stake, proof of work, right? We haven't even gotten to liquid staking, and we haven't even gotten. I mean, we use buzzwords. There are things that are less, but the technology and the innovation around the technology is moving at such a pace, and I believe AI is going to only accelerate that pace. Already, we're seeing what are being called tracer coins, which is an AI-based market maker that can now take any asset, whether capital or not, and turn that into a market. Right, like they can build markets around just about anything now, and using AI, they can easily add liquidity to those markets and open up trading on them. This is something that is still so far away. And so what I think is, and what I've sort of been saying, we have to get the foundation in place. And the foundation is some clear definitions and understanding which regulatory agency will be in that place. And then you have to start to build regulation as markets innovate. And this is the same. This is true for any market today. And whether we're talking about the healthcare market, whether we're talking about biotech, whether we're talking about software, right? As innovators innovate, the policy and regulation is always reactionary. It's always saying, okay, this is a new innovation. How does that fit with the current construct? Does it fit at all? And maybe there needs to be some adjustments made. And so let's adjust and let's move forward. Now, what is key here, and the successful jurisdictions to do this will use principle-based regulation. It will be based on principle. It will be based on some understanding, large general agreement around how do we interact and treat and regulate this space generally. The more specific regulation is, the least effective it is, and the shorter its lifespan, right? Because technology is innovating at such a rate that you can't go dive in and regulate every single form of staking, because tomorrow that type of staking is literally gone, or a new one is created, and you can't just keep asking Congress to go back and back and back. So they need to really step back, take a broader view, I think, of the space, come up with real principle-based legislation, which I think that this bill is a good step in that direction, and then innovate above it. I think that's what the EU has done with MiCA. They've put forward a bill. It's been passed. It creates a framework. Now the agencies develop their rule set underneath that framework. It goes back to Parliament. Parliament agrees, disagrees, fine tunes. And you see this coming. And you already have conversations about 2.0, right? Which is like the understanding that we can't capture everything in one bill, and now we're going to refine this, and now we're going to build up upon that. I think that's the path. And it may not be, the entrepreneur's dream. It may not be how innovators want it to be, but we live in a structured and ordered society. And because of that, we enjoy the benefits of peace and prosperity. And right, like all of that comes we have to agree that that's because of the rules and law-abiding societies in which we live in. And so we're not going to become, anarcho-capitalists. Instead, we're going to say, how do we, use this technology and fight for this technology to be to reach its potential and hope for the benefit to humanity that it represents. And in order for us to do that, we've got to work carefully together with lawmakers across borders and come up with large principle-based regulation.
Yeah, I think this is like a very, very good take here. Because I feel like on Twitter nowadays there's like just a black and white scenario, like this black scenario, everything about this bill is bad, and there are a lot of populistic views on it. But I think we can also, in an ironic way, we can also see some light at the end of the tunnel. I think still the way the SEC declared some assets as a security and others were completely left out of the discussion, I think it still feels a little bit messy.
Right.
And I think the SEC could have done a much better job on it. But to break everything down. So essentially what you were saying in the past half of an hour, more or less, you were saying that it's not only the SEC's fault, there's also the Congress, and the Congress gives out the definition. The SEC's jobs is just to enforce these definitions and make an interpretation of it and act accordingly, whereas also the CFTC is a part of the story. And there was also a communication gap between the CFTC and the SEC, and that the big enterprises were begging for regulation, and that they would also have taken a scenario where everything that has to do with proof of stake would be is declared as a security, which would have been a good thing for them, because finally they would have had their clarity they wished for. It's just in hide and seek right now until we really have clarity in the US in terms of security. So my last question here for you is, from personal point of view, when do you think will we have this clarity, especially coming from the Congress, and what needs to be done in order for the Congress to give out this clarity?
I think it's underway. I think it's in progress, and it's not going to be what the industry thinks. It's not like we're going to suddenly pass a bill and step into the perfect scenario. I don't think that's going to happen. Industry wants that, but it's going to be a process. And so I think we're going to have something probably within the next year, which will be the start. Maybe it's just stable coins. Maybe it's the whole thing. We don't know yet, but I think it's going to be the start of a series of bills which will be used to help frame up this market. And we're probably honestly 4 to 5 years away from being in a place where there's real clarity. And to me, that sounds daunting and it sounds frustrating perhaps, but there'll be wins, little wins along the way, and there'll be setbacks along the way. But the companies that are really building technology that is moving humanity forward will exist and will survive. The companies who are simply building pump and dumps and just trying to gamble on the market are slowly going to find that it becomes harder and harder and harder, and they'll move on to something else, right? Um, and 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 so I think that while 4 or 5 years sounds like a long time, I really don't think in the spectrum of what this impact of technology will have on our culture and on our society, I don't think it's that long to really make sure we get it as right as we possibly can. And so I think that's kind of in my mind, that's the timeline of what we're looking at.
I think this is a lovely way to frame it here towards the end of the interview. Andrew, I think it would be like super cool if you could share with us some social media links and some links for people to follow up on the websites and yeah, all of the platforms that you mentioned to stay on top of everything what you guys are doing.
Yeah. I mean, primarily we are found at owlexplains.com. On Twitter and LinkedIn, it's just at Owl Explains. And personally, it's just my name, at Andrew Hemmingway on Twitter. I'd love to connect with you folks and answer any questions that I possibly can.
Andrew, thanks a lot. And of course, you can find all of the necessary links in the description below. But yeah, thanks again, Andrew. I think this was a super, super important episode here. We shed some light on some things that were in the dark for us. I think it was also super important to have like more of a neutral discussion here and not only this Gary Gensler is a new Burns meme all of the time, but yeah, that there's also like a case to say, okay, the SEC needed to do what the SEC has done at the end of the day. But yeah, again, thank you so much, Andrew, and hope to see you around maybe at the next Ava Labs Avalanche Summit or somewhere else.
Sounds good, Yuri. Thank you so much, man.